the real secret sauce to this is, to probably no one's surprise, is that game designers actually want you to win their game.
Distraction makers.
Okay, so we're going to talk about what Magic and Elden Ring have in common. We're going to talk about ways that Elden Ring and Magic both guide the player through their game design. Before we get into the topic today, if you like the videos that we make here, please like and subscribe. And if you want to discuss anything that we talk about on the podcast more, we have a Discord where we talk about game design and have monthly playtests. So cool, check it out. So in Magic, the way that we this often gets talked about by Mark Rosewater or any other designer, they talk about uncommon signpost uncommons, which usually it's in the context of draft, where they design specific uncommon cards to point you in a particular direction in terms of what kind of draft strategy, what kind of deck you might want to build. In Elden Ring, and also in a lot of, this is one of the reasons why we say like trading card games are pretty similar to action RPGs, in that what can be a signpost in Elden Ring is that you will discover a particular type of item, and it will inspire you to create a build around that item. If you find a greatsword or something, you might want to try to do a greatsword build, that sort of thing. The other really interesting comparison here is that how booster packs in Magic simulate kind of an open world exploration, right? Where you don't have all of the pieces to your ideal strategy from the onset. You are collecting those objects while you're playing the game, in this case, opening boosters. It used to be that you could get this while you're playing the game through ante, right? Where you would literally get treasure. You'd get a reward for beating your opponent, which is fascinating. So when the possibility space at the sort of strategy level is so massive that you don't really know how to put together a deck when you first start, you might be inspired by finding a card that says, hey, maybe build a strategy around me.
When the game first initially came out, I'm sure many people have heard the story, but the fact that like it wasn't ever intended to be what it is now. This was something they sort of stumbled into. And initially the game just having, average cost of $40 to $60 worth of cards with the ante system, it was always intended that players were going to go around and travel around and discover new cards. And that was part of that sort of exploration. But now, I mean, the development of information, and how quickly people can end up getting metas and solving and seeing all these new cards, you don't quite get that as much once you, like I said, are more indoctrinated.
Maybe indoctrinated, it's not the right word.
I don't know.
Infested.
Oh, invested. Yeah, once Magic's infested.
Once you got infested by Magic.
Yeah. But for your average players, I'm sure there are many players that's their initial impact from the game, is they open a few packs with some friends or something and they see some cards and they go, whoa, this card is really, really cool. I've never seen this card. I want to try and make a deck around this particular card. And then you have to learn how, and you have to find other cards that are going to, simulate that build.
Right, and that experience can be quite similar in Elden Ring, right? Like coming across some kind of interesting item. Maybe you can't even use it yet, right? You don't have the stats to be able to use it. And you're like, oh, okay, well, either I want to change my build to become that, or I want to start a new character. And in the same way, you might build a new deck in Magic, right? I'm going to start a new character, and it's going to focus in this other direction.
Yeah, I think one good example of this is like even in the initial starting area of Elden Ring, there's that island just as you get out of the Cave of Knowledge, and you go to the left. If you go down on the beach, there's this little tiny cave. If you go in the cave and you kill a bunch of weird goblin monkey people, and it poops you out, and you're on an island. And that island has a giant dragon corpse on it. Right. And that dragon corpse tells you, well, if you have dragon hearts, you get these things. And all of a sudden, you're like, whoa. One, there's dragons. Two, I can get their hearts. And three, I can learn these really, really cool things if I get their hearts. And all of a sudden, you have a quest, right? And
it's I think the important distinction here is this is mostly intrinsically motivated. Is that you go, whoa, that's cool. I've learned this information. There's not like a dialogue pop up that says go collect dragon hearts or whatever. It's like, oh no, this is just like a one of the experiences that you can do. And Magic in that way is very similar, right? Where some cards will just sort of tickle your fancy and you'll say, I would like to build a Death Shadow deck or something, right?
Sure.
And then sometimes they become, important archetypes like Death Shadow has.
Imagine if you got to that island, right? And you saw the dragon, and the dragon was like, you found me!
Right.
Here's an item!
Yeah.
And you go, that's cool. You got the item, and you can try it right away and stuff, but the quest is gone.
Yep.
There's no more of that build-up to you trying to obtain this thing, right? You got the thing. I mean, I can't, like, a magic equivalent is essentially like, yeah, well, you got the Eldrazi, and it's 0 mana and wins you the game.
Well,
or
like if you opened a booster pack and somehow there was an entire pre-built deck inside of it, and you're like, oh, I guess this
and
is
it's
just
perfectly crafted.
This is just the Eldrazi deck, I guess.
Yeah. You go, thanks, Magic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it at the end of the day here, I think what's most important is, when you're thinking about sort of the player experience and how it can change over time and how you can give players a reason to keep coming back and exploring new things, that can be built into the game system itself and how your game objects are distributed, right?
I also think that I mean, really, in a lot of cases, in particular, you notice this with RPGs, but I think that this exists in all other forms of game, that like it's the old adage of it's not about the destination, it's the journey. And that's essentially what it is, right? It's not about the fact that you found an island with a dragon on it and got this cool dragon spell and that's it, and now you can go and play the game in this way. It's about the fact that you found it and now you have this whole other objective of, and how do you discover that, right? You have to discover your own journey, your own quest to get there. It's different than like if you were to start, let's say, any trading card game, you log into Magic Arena and it says, wow, thanks for logging in. Here's all the top meta decks and here's all the cards for them. And start playing, start climbing the ladder. And it's like, okay.
Get on the grind.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things we see Magic and Elden Ring having in common is what we call telegraphing. And this is one thing that we see as it's a means of possibility space management in sort of helping the player understand what the person that they're playing against, whether that's a human being or AI, is capable of doing.
Right. And I think that, I mean, a lot of games have this. It's very common. I think it's becoming more common over time. I think over time, people have used more and more subtle ways of telegraphing. You've seen previous games, still a lot of games that they end up doing, it's, an attack is coming because there's going to be some reticle or something. It's got big warning signs like this thing's going to happen.
I think one of the interesting things and the reason why Magic, we're sort of comparing and contrasting Elden Ring and Magic, is because both of them sort of use this as almost a bluff at times, where, Magic's classic example being 2 untapped blue mana means your opponent might be able to cast a counterspell. Elden Rings might be in that, say, a boss like Margit will hold up their cane, and you're like, well, when's the attack coming, right? What's the timing here that I'm supposed to be dealing with? The wind-up isn't necessarily telling you exactly when something is coming, where I think a lot of other games might put, like you said, a reticle on the ground or something, and the timing and what that thing is going to be is kind of the same every time. So where I see the similarities between Elden Ring and Magic here is that the component that is telegraphing what might be coming is not indicative of exactly what the thing is going to be. Just that there's a possibility of the thing.
Right. And I mean, we talked a little bit about how Strategy Circle primarily is for orthogonal games, which is usually a player versus player experience, but it doesn't mean it's not used in a player versus environment scenario, which is like Elden Ring. And the way that ends up being used in a strategy way is that you have to have the AI enemy, if you don't fight another player, you have to have the AI enemy react to what the other player is doing. And this is where Elden Ring can bluff, like you said. And so there's a lot of times that you will be playing Elden Ring and you're fighting a boss and they do one move and you dodge it and you're like, all right, okay, I dodged it. I got it. I'm a master at Elden Ring. I can do this. And then they start doing an animation that is not technically the same animation, but very, very similar.
Yeah.
and you think it's going to be the same thing, so you try to dodge it, and then the timing's slightly different, and so you end up getting hit, and then you die, and then you get mad. And a good example of this, we could talk about Malekith, but also just the phase 1 of Malekith's fight when he's still the Beast Clergyman. I hope you put footage of this.
Yeah.
Okay. Is at some point he does 2 different telegraphs for attacks. One, he ends up sliding his claws back one way and grabbing a chunk of ground and then chucks it at the player. And then another, he ends up sliding his claws the other way on the ground and then flings some rocks. And one is a little faster than the other one, and one has like a second of pause. And Elden Ring has all of these pre-existing timers in place so that the player understands the rhythm to go off of with these different attacks and these different telegraphs and stuff. So you understand that both of these exist in the sort of placement of common timers that might exist in an attack. But if you react too quickly from one being telegraphed because it's so similar, you're going to end up getting hit potentially. So that's kind of an opportunity for the AI of Elden Ring to bluff, like you're saying, similarly to the way players in Magic can bluff with their mana.
Right. I think both of these things play on a player's expectation, right? Or you can kind of get into this flow state with both games, right? Where the dance, like what you're talking about, and Elden Ring, Dark Souls games in general are good at creating this dance, which harkens back to sword fighting, way back in medieval times or whatever.
Right.
There's sort of established patterns of play where I have come to expect that this is the rhythm and the pattern that my opponent is executing, and then they subvert that, and now how do I respond accordingly? But more importantly, how has the game design telegraphed that potential change to me?
Yeah.
Right.
And I think, even beyond that, Elden Ring does a really good way of building up boss fights a lot of the time, and that a lot of the times bosses have some sort of a similar animation or similar rig to previous smaller enemies in the build up or lead up to that boss. And I find that you can still get that same sort of an effect in Magic. I mean, this is essentially Magic colors. You could look at those enemies as like an archetype, and you understand as you're going into this sort of larger fight what the possibilities are, because okay, I fought smaller versions of these guys. So, okay, he's going to do this, he's going to do that. I get the same kind of feeling when I fought Morgott after fighting Margit, where I was like, oh, he's got a very similar move set to Margit here.
Yeah.
I've seen this before. I'm kind of getting that same sort of timing and reactions and stuff to this.
Well, right. And one of the really interesting things that Elden Ring does is that it will have some enemies that are bosses earlier on in the game that later just become regular enemies.
Yeah.
And it again is like, you're right. You can learn sort of that enemy's move set and then remember it and understand like what kind of enemy you're going up against, in the same way that like Magic's colors telegraph what your opponent might be capable of.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think that it's funny because if we were to talk about like fundamentals of game design, like why is this important to have a telegraph, as opposed to imagine in a split second you have no reaction time and an enemy is just like boom, boom, dead, gotcha.
Right.
And like I think the real secret sauce to this is, to probably no one's surprise, is that game designers actually want you to win their game. Like they want you to beat the boss. They want you to beat the enemies.
They want you to feel smart.
They want you to feel smart. And so they need to create these opportunities for you to be able to react, make mistakes, obviously, but also be able to sort of take a step back to evaluate the situation.
Right.
And I think that, we recently just had a bunch of discussions in our Discord about summoning sickness, why that exists. This was following our Yu-Gi-Oh episode that we did, where Yu-Gi-Oh does not have summoning sickness.
Yep.
It's a very common thing in card games, and Yu-Gi-Oh decided to get rid of it for very, whatever their reasons might be.
It is kind of unintuitive.
It is. Summoning sickness is unintuitive. Yes, and it's not necessarily that these other games have a form of summoning sickness in a way, right? But in a lot of ways, if you start a boss fight, let's say in Elden Ring or Dark Souls or whatever, a lot of the times you don't just start it. right? You walk in and there's a lot of distance between you and that enemy where you can start to navigate at your own pace and figure out what they're going to do and learn in that way. And I think that what it is it's establishing a puzzle for the player to solve. Right. In the same way that when you end up having a creature that's on board, it feels natural for you to want to have this reaction time because this is a new puzzle. This has changed the board state. It's changed maybe your strategy as a whole, or at least your initial tactical strategy. And so now you want to be able to react to that information. That's all I got.
Okay, cool. So design takeaways here would be that managing your possibility space is really important in terms of strategy games, where you need to give players something that telegraphs what is possible by their opponents. Okay, so what is lore excavation?
Basically, you start the game and you don't really know what it's about. But over time, you might see little snippets. You might see little bits. You see little names here and there. Suddenly, you're looking at a card art, and well, I think I've seen that character. Oh, I thought I saw them in this card. Oh, in this card, oh, it looks like they're dying. Why are they dying in that card?
Oh my god!
Oh my god! In this one, they're happy. In this one, they're dying.
That must have come after that one.
That must have.
It's
Who
almost
the f- is Urza?
It's almost like there's a world here.
It's like there's a world.
Yeah. So seriously though, I think the thing that's so interesting about this idea is that it creates a game for Vorthos, as Magic would call them, right? This is a means of interacting with a particular player demographic and giving them a form of mastery that is outside of strategy, that's outside of, it's connected but outside of the gameplay itself, in that the uncovering of the story, of the lore of the world, of finding sort of these hidden secrets and truths is a game unto itself.
I think we should probably mention Magic used to be better at doing this. And I don't want to say better or worse. I think that's probably not the best terminology. They used to have a different method for how they told the story. It was a lot more subtle. Even in the first set, it wasn't really there. There was, I think a bit of flavor to it, but I think it was primarily when they started exploring the Weatherlight saga and stuff. That's when they started really introducing some of their own narrative into it. And a lot of it was just told through the cards.
Through the art,
primarily.
through the flavor text.
Yeah.
Honestly, I think flavor text is such an interesting choice, right? That flavor text from the beginning of the game gives you this nod to this world and rich lore that exists outside of the individual game piece that you have, and creates kind of a connective tissue between all of the different game pieces that maybe aren't directly in front of you, and sort of prompts you to go, oh, I kind of want to know more, right? It's not just the gameplay that makes me want to know more. It's also the flavor. Interestingly enough, I think this approach in tabletop games is not unheard of, especially in trading card games, but Elden Ring in particular in the video game space, this is something that is much more rare. In that they are almost entrusting in the player that the gameplay itself is compelling enough that you as the player are centered as the protagonist in the story, and that the sort of lore and exposition is not that important, but it is there if you want to pursue it. And that I think what's so fascinating too is it inspires these sort of lore masters for both Magic and Elden Ring, where there's YouTube channels and all kinds of theory crafting and all of this game outside of the game that is created because you have sort of created a scavenger hunt almost within your game.
And I think if you want to see, not to deviate from Elden Ring too much, but it doesn't totally. If you really want to see a great example of this, and probably one that I think popularized it in video games in general, Shadow of the the Colossus, I think it was like one of the first major examples of this. It's not that other games didn't do this, but I think this one was probably the first that hit any sort of mainstream success.
It was one of the reasons why it was groundbreaking. Yeah,
and it's also what inspired the Souls games initially, was playing Shadow of the Colossus,
technically.
Eco, yes, thank you. And seeing how you could tell a story purely through the game's systems and how it makes you feel, and less so of this sort of direct storytelling process, which was so common, I think, probably from, roots of fantasy leading into Dungeons and Dragons, inspired by, which led into JRPGs, which then started trickling into the West. And I think over time, we just started getting used to this idea of, okay, this is a very direct story that we are being told, and we are participants in the story, and less so focused around the player sort of uncovering the story around them.
Right. Yeah. I think that so much of newer video game design, with it being so narrative heavy, I think it's inspired from Hollywood, right? Where you get this sort of like injection of the movie sphere into games, and there's such a rich history and like knowledge base from movies to be brought into games that it has done wonders for the medium. But I think in that process, we have sort of forgotten some of the like player, what I guess we refer to as player as protagonist, in that when you layer on top narrative and character and artifacts from a less interactive medium, you sort of lose the fact that the player themselves is at the center of the story, and their actions and their story is what's really unfolding here in this sort of simulation of reality. Yeah. And that Elden Ring, and I think it's one of the reasons that has led to its success, wholly understands this experience and understands that you as the player coming into this foreign land, you wouldn't be told anything. You're going to have to learn about the world through experiencing the world. Yeah. And sort of act as an archaeologist, if you want to, uncovering the secrets of the world.
What's so funny is that when you end up seeing this lore, and I'm sure it's the same with Magic, is like when you end up seeing someone that is that excavator, that has that interest, one, it's fantastic because you can see their level of interest in it. I don't ever want to do that. But the fact that there are people that are committed and love that is fantastic, because they clearly have a genuine interest in this type of exploration. It's a secondary game to the game itself for those that are interested in that. And you mentioned gameplay payoffs, and I think that we should probably touch on that, because I think both of these games technically have gameplay payoffs, but Elden Ring does do its own unique thing that we haven't seen in Magic, or we can't think of a time that we've seen it in Magic.
If there is, so what we're talking about is you uncovering lore that leads you to an advantage in gameplay. The best example that we can think of in Elden Ring is that you can sort of discover the idea of Margit's Shackle, and then you can find Margit's Shackle, which gives you an advantage when fighting Margit in the boss encounter.
And there's even more. There's like with the Beast Clergyman and Malekith, there's an item that you can acquire there, and if you use it at a certain time in the fight, you get some sort of an advantage.
There's a lot of these for especially the more difficult bosses. Yeah. Now, as far as Magic goes, we cannot really think of a specific example in particular. So if you know of one, please leave it in the comments below.
Yeah, I would love to find out if there's anything like that.
Where like lore connections between cards have led to sort of a deck being created, or some kind of a combo or anything like that, right? We'd be very curious.
That tells the story of what happens in the lore, right? Yeah. Like if you put enough of Urza cards together, is that going to make a really good deck somehow?
Well, there's definitely like the kindred tribal theme stuff that kind of does this, but I'm thinking more in particular of like a flavor text that then had some kind of like combo or in-game strategy payoff.
Right.
Not necessarily just like a lore payoff.
But what Magic does do, at least, is it does do the lore payoff, where a lot of the times there's some sort of a card that maybe is specifically lately they've been doing story spotlights, but also it's just it's something that the card is saying or doing that might not even be specific to the narrative of the set. Yeah. But fulfills that particular story mechanically.
Yeah. Okay, so I think like what is sort of most important here and most interesting to me about this design design strategy is that you are creating a new means of being a master of the game. You're creating a new mastery.
Yeah.
You can be a lore master of Elden Ring. You can be a lore master of Magic. I think one of the major differences too here is that having a game that is built over time, the way that like a trading card game is, gives you the runway to do this kind of stuff. In that, if you're like, you have to do the, if it's like Elden Ring's all front loaded, right? Where like this all needed to be done before the game came out. But like with something like Magic or a game that has a model that is additive, you can sort of build this into the sort of structures of the game so that over time this becomes a rich tapestry